Interesting. I mean, just the struggles, the connections between the supposedly former homelands
Mm.
and students, struggles around access to space, land, place to live. But you were saying earlier that it's more than just a place to live. There are multiple meanings to land. And I think in the opening I mentioned something about the realization of some human rights hinging on access to land. Do you want to share a little bit about the work that you've been doing at LUC around access to land for rural people in former homelands?
Sure. So Lark's work is split around three broad themes, all of which have land at its center in a way. So we work on issues related to traditional governance. So this is the kind of system of governance that operates in the homeland areas, which is a system that's built in customary law. So that's the question of traditional leadership. We then work on land specifically, and in that regard, we work with communities who hold their land rights under a system of customary law, which frequently means that those land rights are considered to be informal and less secure than the types of land rights that might commonly be held in urban areas. And then the third sort of stream around which we do our work is in relation to mining and extractives, an area that you know well as well as Asanda. So the kind of questions around the mining and extractives is obviously how does a community who holds a land right that does not enjoy the same kind of legal security as a place in the urban areas, how do they assert their rights against a mining company that obviously wants to extract minerals from the land that they live on, and the various losses and challenges that come with that. So sort of working across those three broad thematic areas, we're trying to surface the fact that, look, these are rights in land that are just as strong as those that are held under, the quote unquote common law system, that these are rights in land that are, of the same strength as what we think of as ownership, which, in law is kind of the most secure right you could have, and that they are rights that, deserve adequate legal recognition. But also they are rights that must be recognized in a way that's aligned with the actual customary system. And we know that those systems are based on different principles, different ways of being, different types of relationships. And so we try and do the work of assisting communities to put that forward and to make sure it's reflected in law and policy.
Very interesting. You were talking earlier about shifting the middle, and I'm wondering for an old Magogo who's sitting in rural Transkei, who is, or not even in rural Transkei, just last week, the only trustee of the Ingonyama Trust passed away, and a woman who is sitting in the middle of KwaZulu Natal, Ulundi, who's thinking about her access to land and security of tenure. What are some of the things that are happening in these communities, but also what are some of the core struggles, and has a needle shifted for some of the people that you are working with?
Well, this is a key question. So, the simple answer is kind of a bit of a yes and a no. In terms of what are some of the challenges and, what would a woman who lives in rural KZN be struggling with, a lot of it is around more the kind of social element of land versus the legal element. We're all kind of discussing here that in many ways, the law and access to human rights is so far removed from people's everyday reality. So for a woman living in a rural village, Ulundi, her main concern is around her ability to, continue to access the fields that she might be plowing, and ensuring that should, say, for example, her husband pass, she doesn't get kicked off that land, but is able to hold it and to continue to live there. And, she might also be struggling with a traditional leader, perhaps, who, won't allow her particular access to land on the basis of her gender. So we're talking about really kind of fundamental, basic struggles here, everyday kind of just trying to get by, trying to live your life type struggles. And so the reason I would say the answer around moving the needle is both a yes and a no. There have been, important kind of legal advances, some, successful constitutional court cases. But the challenge, Asanda, remains that gap between what happens at those levels of the court, parliament, etc., and what that really means for the lived reality of people in various communities. And closing that gap, I think, is an ever pressing but ever challenging task. So to a certain degree, sure, perhaps there are women in rural parts of the country who have a better understanding of their rights and the protections that are available to them under law. Are they always able to kind of use those in order to access a better life? I couldn't say that for sure. Yeah, so I would say I think it's slow progress moving the needle. It's slow progress.
And then for you, Declan, coming back to students and issues around access to accommodation, I mean, during the fees struggles, we heard about students sleeping in libraries. And we also know we're both in Cape Town. We know about rental prices around Observatory, Rondebosch, and how expensive it is. But we also know not just the prices of rentals. If you move out to places like Salt River, there's gentrification happening. So like and alongside that, we have this need for accommodation for students. As the SRC or as students in the country, what is happening? Like how do we shift the needle, as Nolundi was saying, to realize this for students?
So every year we find institutions in a housing crisis, as you said earlier, with students sleeping in libraries, in lecture theatres. This year at UCT, we haven't necessarily reached the point where we won't call it a housing crisis, but the SRC has been, and students in general, have been very proactive in placing pressure on the university from December to ensure that these private accommodation spaces across Main Road are booked up. But it's a struggle for students, particularly black students on NSFAS. This year, in fact from last year, even when the policy started changing around private accommodation and placing just this entire contradiction within the system that NSFAS students are preferred to go into university residence spaces, but the universities don't have spaces in their residence. So students are left in limbo often, on a waiting list for UCT residence, can't afford private accommodation or can't find a place that's accredited per the policy to go through, and then you find them with family members in the townships on the Cape Flats, stay in small bedroom in spaces that are not conducive. So it really is, and I like you when you said earlier, it's a matter of transformation. The universities weren't prepared. They haven't done the necessary work to prepare the resident space to increase capacity, and just ensure that there is spaces for students to have access to accommodation.
I mean, it sounds also, when you read or when you're seeing what's happening in the country, that some students are just set up for failure from the get-go. Because if you don't have a proper accommodation, how are you supposed to? And not just accommodation, but it comes with food. And that takes us back to the questions you were raising about access to land, you know? I know that you said you're from a fishing community around the Western Cape, and that there's gentrification. Can you share a little bit about the struggles of that community as they pertain to land around where you're from?
That's a nice question to just respond to now, because over the weekend I had returned home, and in preparation I had stepped back, interacted with some of the community members and just observed what is happening. It's a small little fishing community on the west coast, predominantly colored fishing community, and their land solely is the security and comfort of home. There's no farming. The production of the community comes from the sea, but it's a lovely space that, like you said earlier, the middle class loves to visit over the weekends, particularly over a long weekend. The community was packed, was busy, but equally there's this gentrification happening and this mass purchasing of land. You know, it's along the coast. Everyone wants to live along the coast. So you have the old fishing community in the center. You have the government supplied RDP houses that have been built on the one side, and now you're seeing this mass building by predominantly white people of beach houses and getaway homes that it stands empty for most of the year. It's really maybe once, twice a year thing for them to come down, spend the weekend, look at the sea, and then go home. And it's big plots of land that has just been bought up and stands empty in comparison to these small little plots in the RDP and the actual fishing community. And quite regularly you see service delivery protests and land protests by the community. There's one road in, one road out. The road is usually blocked during this because the community members who live there, work there, it's their home, are subjected to these very small plots of land in tight nooked setups, and then in parallel the other side.